Wuhan writer Matt Ridley. Very good morning to you. Great to see you.
Good morning.
Now, the reason I want to talk to you today is because of a big story in the Mail on Sunday yesterday when it emerged that Sir Richard Dearlove, former boss of MI6, although already then an ex-spy chief, back in 2020, before we'd even locked down, he had gone to number 10 when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister with a dossier compiled by top experts saying what they thought the origins of COVID were. Big debate at the time. Was it from the wet markets in Wuhan? Yet, was it someone eating a pangolin or a bat? Or was it from, quite by complete coincidence, the Wuhan lab where they were doing work on coronaviruses? The evidence that he presented to Boris Johnson, which he says the Prime Minister, and with sources close to him suggest he did agree that this was convincing, was completely poo-pooed by a man called Sir Patrick Vallance. Very much in the news, appeared at all those press conferences for those 2 years of the COVID pandemic. He's now Lord Vallance. He was the chief scientific advisor, now a science minister based in the Lords. But he poo-pooed this idea. Now, there is a question mark over why he would poo-poo this idea, and this came up, of course, in your book, your brilliant book, Viral, co-written with Alina Chan, published since the pandemic, about why so many people in high levels in government and in government bodies, both here and in America, working people like Anthony Fauci and others, why they, for some reason, didn't want to publicly accept the idea that COVID had been man-made. What do you think's going on?
Well, I can confirm that Sir Richard Dearlove is right that the information was being given to Boris Johnson and others quite early on, and Dearlove was quicker onto it than I was. It took me a month or so to cotton on to the fact that the lab leak was a real possibility, and that he wasn't. That it was being poo-pooed by the chief scientist and others. Because I've talked to people in number 10 and I've talked to Boris himself, and he said he was getting advice that, no, it's definitely not a lab leak, you can rule that out, please sign off here. And Boris, to his credit, refused to do so. He remained agnostic on the subject. But it was a real problem for the people inside number 10 who realised that the lab leak needed to be taken seriously to get any of the scientific advisors to agree to that. And yet even they, behind the scenes, knew this, because Patrick Vallance was on a crucial telephone call on the 1st of February 2020 with Anthony Fauci and Jeremy Farrar and others.
And these, very, I mean, Anthony Fauci was basically, he was the equivalent of Vallance in America, advising...
And so Jeremy Farrar was chief scientist at the Wellcome Trust, and they were on this phone call where they discussed the possibility of a lab leak and the evidence that was strongly pointing that way. And yet, at the end of that phone call, they all agreed that an article would be written, which came out 5 years ago today, incidentally, poo-pooing the idea. It was called Proximal Origin. It fooled me. It fooled a lot of other people.
So they had a conversation. They all agreed in this conversation, and there are emails that were sent since. There's loads of evidence of this conversation, loads of people involved. They all the top scientific and medical advisors to major, to America and British governments, basically agreed it was rather likely that it had come from the Wuhan lab.
The phrase used by the lead author of the article that came out 5 years ago was "so friggin' likely."
So friggin' likely. So, and yet publicly, so they wrote this article that was basically definitive. No, it's not. Anyone who talked about this being the likelihood coming from a lab leak in China was told it was a conspiracy theory, it was disinformation. People were taken off social media, they lost their accounts. Donald Trump...
You were banned on Facebook
if you said that. Until suddenly, randomly, Joe Biden said, a few years later, it probably was a lab leak. And then suddenly there was an acceptable view. Now, why did they want to shut this down? What was the significance of whether or not this was something that had emerged from because someone ate a pangolin that had eaten a bat or something in a wet market in Wuhan, a city pretty much none of us had ever heard of before COVID, and now heard to our cost, rather than something that was cooked up in a lab in Wuhan? And I don't think most sensible people are saying it was deliberately leaked by the Chinese. It was just a lab leak, incompetence, accidental leak that the Chinese then tried to cover up because it made them look bad. Why on earth would the Americans and the British, particularly the scientists, want to cover that up?
Well, I think there were two motives. One was to not upset the Chinese. And I've had this said to me explicitly by senior scientists: we better not find out in case it annoys the Chinese.
Why?
I said to this guy, you don't say that about a plane crash. You didn't say that about the Titanic. You don't say that about Bhopal. You do try and find out so it doesn't happen again. And you don't care who it upsets. But they did. They really did. And for example, Nature magazine, the
which is
House Journal
very,
of Science,
very important,
has just done a big piece saying 4 lessons for virology from the pandemic. Well, they don't mention the lab leak. That's like writing 4 lessons from the maiden voyage of the Titanic without mentioning the iceberg. It's bizarre, and so that was one thing. Please don't let's upset the Chinese. They fund a lot of science. They collaborate with us. They pay for a lot of the expense of publishing journals. That's a big part of it.
They fund a lot of universities and their research.
And the other reason was this might rebound badly on the reputation of science. Scientists might find it harder to get public support for grants, for vaccines, for pharmaceuticals, etc., if the public realises that a mistake has been made within
science. There's a sort
science.
of evil scientists working in a lab in their white coats, and they're the ones who caused all this problem for us.
Well, and what they should have said to themselves was, look, we need to admit that a rogue lab that was doing unsafe work that should never have been done at the wrong biosafety levels, which we know to be true, by the way, was wrong. And then the reputation would have been confined to just one Chinese lab. As it is, they have now had the effect that the whole of science is mistrusted by a large percentage of the population.
Well, and it is. Again,
vaccines and everything.
It's when people like me, and I grew up early on, if the scientists say this or that, it seemed to me that would be true. Now I don't trust a word. And when I see scientific studies, I think, well, hold on a minute, who's funding that? And it's maybe good to be a little bit more critical and to be less trusting. But again, that is something that scientists, and I think they've done it over climate change as well, refusing to have proper discussions about things. They've thrown away the scientific reputation. But come back to
their own reputation.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Come back to what was actually going on in that Wuhan lab, because it always seemed to me to be risible. I mean, absolutely laughable that people would say, no, of course it can't be what's happened in the Wuhan lab. It must just have been just an accidental, case that something's happened in the wet market with all these strange animals that are being kept, some alive, some dead, in these wet markets in China. Because should we say, the circumstantial evidence for it being a lab leak is pretty strong. First of all, what was it they were actually doing at this lab? Well,
there's 40,000 markets in China.
Yeah.
There's one lab in the world that was doing experiments on sarbecoviruses like this, and it's in Wuhan. And the experiments it was doing was to take bat viruses from the wild 1,000 miles away in southern China, bring them all the way to Wuhan, manipulate them, swap their spike genes with some going into others, as a result increasing the infectivity of the viruses sometimes up to 10,000 times. We know that. That's a published experiment.
Why would they want to do that? That's the bit most of us don't get.
The theory was that it was going to enable them to predict and prevent the next pandemic, and then they'd get the Nobel Prize. But that went well, didn't it? They predicted their own pandemic, many people think.
Okay, so but the idea is, so we're going to work out how if a disease was terrible, or if a baddie, a James Bond style baddie was doing this work, we would then know how to deal with it.
Yes, in the long run, the aim would be to develop a pan-coronavirus vaccine that would work against any of these dangerous bat viruses, and that's not a sort of risible aim, but it was actually. It turned out that what they were doing was looking for a gas leak with a lighted match.
Couldn't we just, wouldn't it be better to, kill all the bats that might have this virus? Would that not seem a simple solution?
Up till the middle of 2021, we didn't know for sure what, how close they were to making this particular virus. And then a document leak called the Diffuse Proposal, which should have been shown to us right at the start, but took 2 years to come out. And that document said our next plan is to put a thing called a furin cleavage site into a SARS-like virus for the very first time. This is the only SARS-like virus we've ever seen with a furin cleavage site in exactly that location.
So they said they were going to do it. It exists, and it killed a lot of people, and we're supposed to pretend that these things aren't linked. Am I not right in thinking also that what was going on in this lab in Wuhan, in the middle of nowhere in China, was actually part funded by the Americans, by American scientific bodies, including the ones headed by Anthony Fauci?
Yes, the US Allergies and Infectious Diseases, National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, as well as USAID, as well as the Pentagon, all put money that went to this lab.
Surely part of the cover-up then would have been, let's just not embarrass the fact that America has funded this scientific work in China that has caused this massive pandemic.
Well, there's, if you were one of the people who had signed off on sending millions of dollars to the Wuhan lab and this thing happened, you would be inhuman if you didn't desperately want this not to be
come out.
A lab leak.
Because this is relevant. It's relevant in terms of we should, knowing things anyway is a good thing. It is better that we know facts and know the truth. But it's also very relevant to preventing the next pandemic, because if the last pandemic was caused by this sort of human error, can we please, if we're going to do these sort of experiments, there's an argument not doing them, but if we're going to do them, let's ensure that we've got a body that is overseeing the security and the safety in these labs to prevent something like this happening again. Whether we can or not is a question mark.
The extraordinary thing is there's been no change in biosafety regulations since the pandemic.
This could just happen again tomorrow.
Not only that, but rogue actors are, bad actors are looking at this and worrying about it.
The Iranians, I'm sure, are looking at this. Putin's looking at this.
Exactly.
Xi Jinping, happily.
And by the way, there's quite an important potential lesson in here, which is the puzzling thing about this virus was that it was so infectious from the get-go. That's very unusual for an animal virus. Normally it struggles to transmit between people. The reason may be because it had been in a lab trained on things, so it trained on human cells. So it could be that the main lesson here is that we are much more likely to spark a global pandemic with lab accidents than we are with markets.
Brilliant. So let's carry on doing that and denying that we're doing it and not making it any safer.
I'm afraid so. I mean, it's I didn't start out thinking this. As I said, the first few months I was going around telling people, no, it's probably not a lab leak. These scientists have written this paper saying it isn't. I feel really betrayed on this.
Patrick Vallance, now Lord Vallance, not elected but a government minister, a science minister. He's been poo-pooing all of this all along. He's basically one of the people in charge of governing science in this country. But he's an anti-scientist, because if you don't want to go with the evidence and the facts, you don't want to go with scientific processes, you're not a supporter of science.
Well, I think he's a well-meaning, decent man.
Why do we always think that?
Well, I don't know. I've met him. He's perfectly pleasant and he's tried to do the right thing on other issues. But he is in Parliament now, and therefore there is a method of calling him to account before select committees or at questions. And this needs to happen, because exactly why he suppressed this very important story and keeps doing so, because just in response to the Mail on Sunday article, they said, we're leaving it to the WHO. Well, we know that's what they said to me.
We're not doing that again.
And the WHO are hopeless on this.
So good, Rich. You've been absolutely fantastic. There's some wonderful helping to expose this and to help explain it to those of us who are not, science boffins. Matt Ridley, former Conservative peer writer.
And Newcastle United supporter.
A very happy Newcastle United supporter. And author of Viral, co-written with Anita Chan.
And a new book.
Come back in. All of your books are actually brilliant. And your fascinating book, Birds, Sex and Beauty, which sounds a rather different kind of book. I promise we'll get you back in again. Just want to get a quick reaction from Sam Armstrong listening to all of this.
Yeah, I found the thing most shocking was that Sir Richard Dearlove, the former MI6 director or chief, had been the one who had to do it. I can remember at the time, I've never said this before, but one day it just turned up on my desk a big list of some of the evidence from the Wuhan lab's own website of them breaching their own standards for level 4 biosafety stuff, and put it into a newspaper. But there were intelligence officers in this country that felt like they were being stopped from doing their job by a system that just simply didn't want to hear that the open source blatant information. And actually what happened is, in the 6 months it took for people really to start looking, that the Chinese lab destroyed all of its own databases, all of the publicly owned available information, and there's so much about it that could have been found,
and the usual people mysteriously disappearing as well. Absolutely fascinating. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do get in touch.